and welcome to the IIFT 2021 analysis. As you would already be knowing, IIFT 2021 was conducted on the 5th of December, and there were no surprises in terms of the nature of the test or the conduct of the test. So if you have to have an overview of the test pattern, the pattern was more or less similar to what happened the year before. There was no change in pattern at all. There were 4 sections that were present. There was no surprise in terms of it being a 6-section test. So there were 4 sections that were present, which were all on expected lines. The number of questions also remained constant at 110. So that has been the pattern in IIFT 2019 as well as IIFT 2020, which was conducted in 2021. So the number of questions remained the same at 110. The total duration that you got to solve these questions was 120 minutes, so 2 hours test. There was no sectional time limit as such. You were free to allocate time to each and every section according to your preference and the level of difficulty of the sections. And if you look at it, the number of marks that you got per correct response was 3. So for 3 of the 4 sections, visibly quantitative ability, verbal ability, reading comprehension, and data interpretation, logical reasoning, you got 3 marks for every correct response. Whereas for the general awareness section, you got 1.5 marks for every correct response. If you look at the negative marks that were present, for every incorrect answer that you gave in terms of verbal ability, reading comprehension, data interpretation, logical reasoning, and quantitative ability, you invited a negative of -1. Whereas for the general awareness section, for every incorrect response, you would invite a negative score of 0.5 marks. So that was the test pattern. There was nothing different compared to what happened over the previous 2 years, and people who would have solved the previous 2 years paper would have found this to be extremely relatable. Now, if you look at the overview of the entire test, the test had 4 sections: quantitative ability, verbal ability, reading comprehension, data interpretation, logical reasoning, and general awareness. The number of questions in each of these sections has been given on the screen here. So 25 questions in QA, 35 questions in VA plus RC, 30 questions in DI plus LR, and 20 questions on general awareness. The marks per question and the negative marking we have already discussed. If you would have gone through our video on how to prepare for the IIFT exam, you would have seen the suggested time allocation, and it was more or less consistent with what we had discussed back then. Around 30 to 35 minutes for the 3 larger or major sections, and around 5 to 10 minutes for GK would have done the deal in this particular test. So the pattern was more or less consistent as to what we had discussed earlier. Now, if you look at the verdict, so this is something that I'm sure a lot of you are keenly looking at. We are expecting the cutoff for general category male students to be around 123 to 127 marks. Now, mind you that the cutoff at which you will end up getting a call is dependent on a lot of factors beyond your IIFT score. So it's not just your IIFT score that will be considered when it comes to giving you a shortlist. They will also consider your 10th standard marks or 12th standard marks, the diversity that you bring to the table in terms of your graduation background and your gender. And after all those things are considered, you will be given a composite score. And based on that composite score, it will be decided whether you are going to get a call or not. So this 123 to 127 is an indicative value. Of course, if you have a very good profile, the cutoff might be less than this. And if you have sort of a weaker profile compared to the average profile that people have, then you might have to score slightly more than this 123 to 127 marks. But looking at the pattern and looking at the past couple of years of tests, 123 to 127 is definitely achievable, considering that this is a single institute test. If you look at the sectional cutoffs, of course, the sectional cutoffs are bare minimum. In some cases, we have seen that people with around 50 to 60 percentile in a section are also considered to be the benchmark for sectional cutoffs. We are estimating it to be slightly on an ambitious side, right? So it might be less than what numbers that we have given here, but what we expect people to solve is what we have presented here. So in quantitative ability, we expect an average aspirant to solve around 3 to 4 questions correctly, bare minimum. And so the sectional cutoff, expected cutoff would be around 10 to 12 marks for QA. In terms of VARC, the sectional cutoff is 32 to 35. So this is based on the official figures that we had from last year's IIFT. In terms of data interpretation and logical reasoning, it's 20 to 22 marks. And in terms of general awareness, around 6 to 7 marks, or around 4 to 5 absolute correct answers would be enough for you to clear the cutoff. Now, if you look at the cutoffs corresponding to female students, then that would be around 5 to 7 marks. fewer compared to what we have given here. If you are looking at cutoffs for OBC students, that might be somewhere around 105-ish marks. And if you look at the cutoffs for SC, ST students, it might be somewhere in the 80s. So that is the estimate that we have. But again, your composite profile is what matters the most. And on the basis of your composite profile, would it be decided if you are to get a call or not? Now, coming to the first section, the data interpretation and logical reasoning section, if you look at it, it was more or less similar in terms of nature, in terms of split, when you compare it to IIFT 2019 or IIFT 2020. Now, the section can be said to be medium to difficult at an overall level. And of course, that is a function of the amount of time that is available for you to solve the particular section. So if you had 1 hour to solve this entire section, you would have got almost everything correct. But considering that you have to solve the section in 35 to 40 minutes, that would have been a challenging affair. So out of the entire set or the entire section of 30 questions that you had, there were 2 questions that were standalone in nature. There was one question on coding and decoding, which was very easy and should have been attempted. There was another question on verbal reasoning, which was the only verbal reasoning question in this entire section. And again, that was on the easier side. So these 2 questions should have been attempted. We would classify them under the logical reasoning side of things. Then if you look at the logical reasoning side of things in terms of the sets that were present, there were 4 sets that were present. The surprise this year was that there was no input-output question. So the sets that were present here, there were 4 in number. One set was based on matrix arrangement, which was an especially difficult set. It was probably the toughest set out of the entire all the sets that were present in this entire section. So there was a 3 question set on matrix arrangement, which was moderate to difficult. Another 3 question set on tournaments, which was again medium difficult, and a family tree question, which was extremely easy. So even this thing remained consistent with what had happened earlier. If you look at the logical reasoning side of things, there were 14 questions out of 30 that were present. Now, if you look at the data interpretation part of this section, there were 16 questions that were present, and this was again nothing out of the ordinary. Data interpretation has traditionally had 16 questions split into 4 sets of 4 questions each. But this year, if you look at it, the sets were all deceptive in nature because each set had multiple graphs or charts that were present. So people who would have gone with the mindset that DI was a difficult section, even before reading the questions, even before reading the data that was present, would have been in for a surprise because these sets were not difficult per se. In fact, from whatever analysis we have done so far, it has come to our notice that data interpretation was easier than the logical reasoning part as well. So people who would have spent slightly larger amount of time in the data interpretation part would have benefited a bit more is our understanding of the situation. So there were 4 sets that were present. There was a set on 2 pie charts, which was easy to moderate in terms of level of difficulty. There was a set on 4 line graphs, which was again easy to moderate in terms of difficulty. And these 2 were the ones that you should have solved. The third most difficult set in terms of level of difficulty was the one on 2 bar graphs, which was on the moderate slide, but again could have been attempted. The last one, which was a bar graph plus a table graph, was the one that was the most difficult, and this could have been left alone. Overall, if you look at this section, out of the 30 questions that were present, it was possible to attempt around 12 to 14 questions with a reasonable amount of accuracy when it came to this particular section. So in terms of the IIFT, if you look at it historically, for people who end up scoring very well at the test, their scores would be split almost equally among the 3 major sections. So sticking true to that particular belief or line of thought, we are expecting the number of questions to be attempted in this particular section to be around 12 to 40, which would result in a score of roughly 35 to 40 marks. So that is what we're expecting from this particular section. In terms of reading comprehension and verbal ability, if you look at the overall nature of the section, it was fairly straightforward. It was consistent with what had happened, with 16 questions from reading comprehension and 19 questions from verbal ability. In terms of reading comprehension questions, if you look at it overall, it was on the moderate side if you were to take a stand. Again, considering the verbal ability side of things and the reading comprehension side of things, we can say that the entire section was of moderate level of difficulty. In terms of reading comprehension, there were 2 passages that had 3 questions each, and there were 2 passages that had 5 questions each. The ones that had 3 questions each were approximately of 600 to 700 words, and they were on the easier side and so should have been attempted for sure. The ones that consisted of 5 questions were on the difficult side in terms of the nature of the passage, the context in which the questions were based, and the overall level of difficulty. So they were based on slightly difficult concepts, which would have been challenging to grasp. the number of questions was also higher, making it a slightly more expensive affair. And definitely the length of the passage was also on the higher side, saying considering that they were around 1,000 words each. So the 5 pointers or the sets that had the passages that had 5 questions each were on the difficult side and could have been left alone. The ones that had 3 questions each were on the easier side and should have been solved for sure. In terms of the verbal ability section, if you look at it, the verbal ability section was slightly easier compared to the previous IIFT. And that's why if you look at the split here, we can see everything that can be classified either as easy or medium. It was extremely dominant in terms of vocabulary, and people who had a decent hold on vocabulary would have been able to crack these questions very quickly. If you look at the amount of time that you would have spent on this section on a whole, around 30 minutes would have been spent on this particular section. And if you look at the amount of time that it would have taken you to crack the vocabulary questions or the verbal ability based questions, you would have been here for a big haul if you had good hold on vocabulary and grammar. So in this case, if you look at it, there were some questions that were based on correct spellings. There was this one question. Then there were 3 questions that were based on identifying the sentence with correct word usage. We had to find the language of the root word, again, fairly straightforward if you knew what the various roots across various languages looked like. One word substitution, a couple of questions, very easy. Foreign phrases, language of foreign phrases, again on the easier side. Antonyms, idioms, so all those things were mainstream vocabulary questions that you would have come across if you would have prepared for the IIFT well. Overall, if you look at the entire section, out of the 35 questions that were present, it was possible or it was very easy to attempt around 20 to 22 questions. So around 3 to 6 questions or around 6 to 8 questions could have been attempted from the RC side of things, and the remaining 16 odd questions you could have attempted from the verbal ability side of things. So even discounting for the moderate-ish level questions from verbal ability, it was definitely possible to attempt around 20 to 22 questions with a reasonable amount of accuracy of around 80 to 85%. If you look at the next section on general awareness, the overall level of difficulty of this section was on the moderate side. Again, if you look at it objectively compared to the past IIFT paper of IIFT 2020, then we can say that general awareness was on the easier side this year. The number of questions was 20, as we have already discussed. The questions were a mix of normal MCQs and the match the column kind of questions that we have come to associate IIFT with. So there were 2 columns wherein the data in one column had to be matched with that in another column. Again, mainstream IIFT pattern in which GK is asked. If you look at the split of the questions, there were 9 questions that were based on static GK, and there were 11 questions that were based on current affairs. Overall, if you look at it, this section was on the easier side compared to what had happened in the past year. And so we expect the number of attempts or the performance of the people to go up in this particular section. The questions that were present from a lot of various arenas of sports, say geography, government policies, institutions, and all those kind of things, brands and everything, right? So there was a nice, healthy mix of questions, which would not have given an advantage to a specialist. So you had to be aware of a lot of things going on around you to answer this particular section well. People who would have gone through the IMS material would have found it very easy to attempt a lot of these questions because they were present of the capsules. They were present in the capsules that you would have gone through. So overall, if you look at it, the number of attempts that you would have made in this section would be around 11 to 12 questions. And of course, because it's a general awareness section, we expect the accuracy to be slightly on the lower side here with about 60 to 70% of your answers being correct. Overall, if you look at it, if you attempt 11 questions and you get, let's say, around 7 of them right, you should clear the cutoff easily and should also get some bonus marks which would boost your overall score. Now coming to the last section on quantitative ability, this section was slightly more difficult compared to last year's IIFT section, and it was possibly the most time consuming section. So people who would have spent a disproportionate amount of time in this particular section would have lost out on easier opportunities that were available in the other sections. If you look at this particular section, the major surprise was that there was dominance of modern mathematics. So if you look at the number of questions, there were 8 questions that were present, out of which 7 could have been classified as being moderate or difficult. So there were absolutely no easy pickings when it came to this particular topic. If you look at arithmetic as well, out of the 7 questions that can be classified under arithmetic, only 2 were easy. Out of the 6 questions from geometry, only 2 were easy. Out of the 3 questions from algebra, 2 were easy, 1 was difficult, but these were manageable questions. And numbers, there was just 1 question which can be classified as easy. So this year's quant was slightly more difficult compared to last year's quant, and people who would have taken it on their ego and would have sort of felt that they are not able to solve questions fluently, and that's why they needed to put in more effort or more amount of time solving this thing, would have led to a disaster, right? So people would not have done well, who would have got stuck in this particular section. So the wise thing to do here was to let go of this section completely, back your prep, get the minimum cutoff that you thought was possible, around 15 to 20 marks, let's say, for example, and then moved on to other sections and only came back to this section if there was time left at the end. If you look at it overall, the number of attempts that you could have made in this particular section was around 9 to 10 questions. But again, if you look at it, there are no 9 questions that I can say that can be classified as easy. We have only found out 8 questions that we can classify as easy. So people would have to attempt around 2 to 3 moderately difficult questions as well if they wanted to show a good attempt at this particular section. But the wise thing was to sort of let go of this entire section, or not run behind attempting each and every one of the 25 questions that we had here. And after you had bagged a good number of attempts, you should have gone to another section and would have done well there. So overall, if you look at it, there was no major surprise as such. Some people found the interface to be slightly irritating, right? It was slightly difficult to scroll through all the sections, considering that there was a palette on the left that had all the sections that you had, and for all the section based questions, you had all the questions on one page. So all those things made it slightly difficult. It was slightly irritable for a lot of candidates from what has been reported. But on the overall side, if you look at it, IIFT is a test that caters to only one institute. Of course, there are various campuses, but it's one institute at the end of the day. So considering the competition, there is always a possibility that a lot of people would have been able to adapt to this interface well and would have been able to crack the test easily. So definitely, I think it was a crackable test. If you had gone through the past IIFTs and you had gone through the mocks that were present on the IMS portal, you would have done a good job over. Right? So of course, the test is done. Now you don't really have to worry about this test as such. If everything goes according to plan, then you will get your response sheets, you will get your score, you'll get to calculate your score and everything within a few days or a few weeks. But till then, you have to go to the next test that you are preparing for and keep on preparing as the season progresses. So all the best for the next test. I hope you have done well in this particular test. If you have any feedback to share, anything that you feel happened according to your plans or did not happen according to your plans, feel free to put your comment in the section below, and we will try to respond to it to the best of our ability. All the best, everyone. Happy learning.